Metro Vancouver has developed the best small city transit network in North America, and arguably it's up there with the best transit networks in North America more broadly. While this is great news, being on the top can lead to a little bit of complacency. Years back, and I remember this from being in high school, we set out a vision with the Mayor's Council plan for Metro Vancouver Transit, which kind of set the stage up to around the late 2020s. Now we're seeing a lot of that plan come to fruition. SkyTrain is being extended to Surrey and probably Langley. The Broadway subway extension out to at least Arbutus is already under construction, with the portion to UBC surely to follow, and it seems like we're moving forward with the Burnaby Mountain Gondola. In addition, we've seen the B line, or now rapid bus improvements we expected, with new lines being introduced and services being improved, so the question sort of becomes, what's next? Now, to be clear, the Transport 2050 plan is sort of meant to fill this gap, but when I was back in Vancouver this summer and I remember seeing some of the advertisements for it, it was talking about things like flying cars and automated vehicles and kind of out there technologies, which are great, but they don't form the basis for a realistic transit plan for the next 30 years. What we really need is long-term rail and bus expansion plans that think about covering new areas of Metro Vancouver and increasing core capacity. With the latest phase of projects underway, being the final phase of the Mayor's Council vision, we really need to say what's next. In this video, I'm going to talk about what projects I think should come next in Metro Vancouver. I'm going to start by talking about less expensive and more realistic plans, and I'm going to work my way up to some out there plans that are things I'd personally like to see on the 20 to 30 year time horizon. To be clear, this is the time horizon we should be planning things like rail transit on, so it's not really unrealistic, and perhaps some of these ideas we'll see also adopted in the Transport 2050 plan. Let's get into it. If you're not already, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell icon so you don't miss a single video. Consider following me on Twitter as well as Instagram and supporting the channel via Patreon. I'm going to start with a few boring projects. These are really about enhancing the bones of public transit in Metro Vancouver. They're nice to haves and small things that I think could be implemented in parallel with larger plans. The first thing I think would be a natural step is to expand and improve Compass. Compass is already arguably the best fare card solution in North America, but it can get even better. Something which obviously makes sense is making Compass cards available on mobile phones. This continues to lower the barrier to entry to the transit system. In addition, rolling out Compass to shoulder areas of Metro Vancouver probably also makes a lot of sense. Perhaps being able to use your Compass card in Victoria, Abbotsford, and in the Sea to Sky areas would be valuable. This way, people traveling from Metro Vancouver on transit to these shoulder areas would be able to continue to use their Compass card, and those who frequently travel between the various systems would be able to acquire a Compass card for easier transfers. In addition, Compass should be expanded within Metro Vancouver. Things like bike share and perhaps, yes, shared scooters or car share should all be able to be paid using a Compass card. This is sort of following the vision set out by Japanese fare cards like Pasmo and Suica, which can be used broadly for mobility as well as things like convenience stores. The second project is about accessibility. It's accessibility improvements at various stations, as well as something I like to call the elevator redundancy project. It doesn't sound super exciting, but it's about really taking Metro Vancouver's accessibility on our transit to the next level. Currently, the whole SkyTrain system is accessible. It's interesting living in Toronto, seeing us slowly make our transit system accessible. It's a good step, but Metro Vancouver is already ahead, and we should continue to move forward. The next step is to make sure every station has redundant elevators, starting with the most important stations and working your way down. Redundant elevators mean having 2 elevators to access every platform. The benefit of this is that when one elevator is out of service, which if you ride the Canada Line in particular seems to be pretty frequently, people with accessibility needs will still always have an elevator option. This means that the system is even more accessible, and the elevator uptime should be almost 100%, meaning that even during scheduled maintenance, stations remain accessible and we don't need to provide shuttle services. Now, speaking of bikes, we should be expanding our bike infrastructure drastically. Now, it was part of the Mayor's vision, but I want to see even more. For example, at park and ride facilities or transit hubs, I'd like to see bike parkades. We currently see them primarily at rail stations, but I think somewhere like the South Surrey Park and Ride or Carvolth Exchange in Langley would be great places to put a bike parkade. These areas are pretty suburban, but if you add the bike parkade, there's a lot more options people have in the surrounding areas to get to the station. At the busiest stations, we should be continuing to implement large-scale indoor bike parkades, not exactly the smaller ones we see at stations like Burquitlam. I think that this actually makes a lot of sense in downtown areas. Even if bike parkades can't be directly attached to stations, even just placing them across the street would be really valuable. That way commuters into core areas could use a bike for the last mile of their trip. This is good because I don't think everyone should have to use bike sharing, and being able to have the flexibility of your own bike in a core area is really valuable. Looking at large urban bike parking solutions that you see in places like Japan and the Netherlands would be a great model here. Of course, we should also continue to improve bike access to stations. A lot of suburban rail stations have terrible bike access. Providing separated bike lanes to suburban stations would be another great way of expanding their catchment areas. Next up, let's talk about the express highway bus services. Now, I talked a lot about these services in my video here, and I think they could be drastically expanded. These are services like the 350 class on Highway 99 and the 555 on Highway 1. In both cases, these services should be expanded, both in terms of scope and breadth. I really think it makes sense to turn them into 24-hour services. They serve really important corridors and they connect to 24-hour services along SkyTrain lines. In addition, this would go a long way to extending transit services that are 24 hours deeper into the suburbs. Currently, 24-hour transit services stop at Surrey Central. But with the extension of the highway buses to becoming 24 hours, which wouldn't even necessarily require that many more buses, I think you could probably do it with 2 buses per route, you'd be able to start serving North Langley and South Surrey with 24-hour service, which would be really exciting. Now on the ends, these services should be expanded to new destinations. For example, there's no reason the 350 series shouldn't be able to be extended to South Langley via 32nd Avenue. And for the 555, it should probably be extended further out to Aldergrove and perhaps eventually Abbotsford via new HOV lanes on Highway 1. This would provide a great alternative to West Coast Express service, which doesn't operate all day and which doesn't travel south of the Fraser at the moment. Services don't need to be extensive at the beginning, but over time they could be expanded, so that the trunk sections feature very frequent service that's really in line with rapid transit. You could even have super express services like you see on Highway 99 right now, where some buses bypass stops, leading to even faster trip times. I also think it's worth considering having maybe 555A and B and C routes that would hop off the highway to serve local areas near Carvolth Exchange and future extensions. This would take advantage of the dedicated infrastructure along the highways and allow for larger catchments to be served without transfers. Next up is electrification of buses. My recent video about trolley buses stirred a lot of conversation, which I'm excited about. For Metro Vancouver, it would be fantastic to see trialing of in-motion charging on the trolley bus network. This would allow larger swaths of Burnaby, as well as New Westminster and Richmond to be served by electric buses that have in-motion charging along trolley routes in Vancouver. We should also look at expanding our electric bus services. Since trolley bus routes don't exist in the suburbs right now, focusing electric bus deployment on busy suburban routes is a good way of sort of balancing the zero emissions transit throughout the region. Now for our final good bones transit improvement project, I want to talk about yard expansion for the SkyTrain. One fantastic thing we've seen is there are a lot of plans to expand yard capacity. But what I'd like to see going further is more provision for future yards in projects we're building. SkyTrain is an important network and it's only going to become busier and more congested in the future. So any future yards we're building and any future extensions we're building should be very smart about laying aside land for the future to provide more yard space for fleet expansions. The first project I want to talk about for expanding rail transit service would be a DMU service on the West Coast Express. While the current government has talked about expanding West Coast Express service, I think a DMU service between Coquitlam Central or Moody Centre and the stations further east would be a valuable way of expanding service into an all-day market. Currently, West Coast Express is peak only, and that's because of limited capacity between Coquitlam Central and Moody Centre and Waterfront. However, the corridor east of Moody Centre and Coquitlam Central has space to expand with more tracks, and so I think adding a DMU service would be a valuable way of serving these stations all day. A good example of this sort of service would be the O train in Ottawa. Such a service could be implemented quite inexpensively and would massively improve transit access in eastern areas of the Metro Vancouver region. Now, the next project would be more of a study, and that's a study into the feasibility of expanding the Expo and Canada lines in the long term, 20 to 30 years out. These studies would be very important, and what they would focus on is the feasibility of extending stations on the Expo line to serve 6-car trains and extending stations on the Canada line to serve 4-car trains. To be clear, these lines are not designed at the moment to serve trains of those lengths, but cities around the world with long-running metro systems have found ways to expand stations and extend platforms, at least at key stations, so that longer trains can serve those routes. This is important because there's a certain baseline load on stations on the Expo and Canada Line due to transit-oriented development along their lengths. Personally, I think it would be completely feasible to serve the Expo Line and the Canada Line with longer trains. You'd likely need substation upgrades to provide power for those longer trains, and new yards would have to consider space for longer trains, but in the Canada Line's case, you could create those 4-car trains simply by coupling 2 existing Canada Line train sets. The reason this is so important to the rest of our plans is that if the Canada Line and Expo Line can't have their capacity expanded, then we need to consider alternate routes which would augment the capacity on these core corridors. Next up, since the Canada Line and soon the Expo Line will have standardized rolling stock, meaning just one model of train operating on these lines, we need to move forward with platform screen doors. Montreal's RAM will soon be operating with the first large-scale deployment of platform screen doors in Canada, and expanding them to our automated rail system just makes sense. Not only do they improve safety, but they also improve reliability and allow you to do things like having active heating and cooling in some core stations. Now, dependent on how capacity looks on the Expo and Canada Line, the plans would sort of branch out. If we need to consider new lines to augment the Canada and Expo lines, I'd consider talking about a line on Arbutus, or perhaps Fraser or Victoria, as well as a line across the Port Mann and along the Highway 1 corridor south of the Fraser. Then I would also suggest, along with that, a limited extension of the SkyTrain network up to North Vancouver. Something I've considered for this is an extension of the Canada Line. To be clear, the Canada Line couldn't be extended from its waterfront station because of its depth being too shallow, but I think it's possible to have a new second station at Vancouver City Centre below the existing station, which would serve trains to North Vancouver, as well as a new hub at Waterfront. Using Canada Line trains to serve North Vancouver simply makes sense. The smaller trains would be right-sized for the demand for that market. Now, let's say the Expo and Canada Lines could be expanded. Then what my plans would call for is a more extensive expansion to North Vancouver, meaning lines that would go beyond just Lonsdale Quay, and then investments to expand capacity on the Canada Line and Expo Line via station expansions and yard expansions. Now, with those more immediate needs considered, what comes next? Going forward, what we'd likely want to consider in Metro Vancouver is new rail services in core regions as well as in the suburbs. For Surrey, I think building the L line that was originally planned for light rail as some sort of automated metro line makes sense. I don't necessarily think using the same technology as the rest of the SkyTrain makes sense here, so something like the technology used on the Copenhagen Metro or HART could make sense. By that I mean smaller technology that's more in line with the capacity of the Canada Line. This is important because there's only limited capacity on the Expo Line at present, and so we shouldn't provide too much rail capacity to Surrey Central in the near future. In core areas of the region, I would start talking about a circle line. My proposed circle line would travel east on Hastings from Waterfront Station before traveling south on Willingdon to connect with Brentwood Town Centre and eventually Metrotown before traveling west along the 41st Avenue corridor. This circular line would be quite interesting because it would be able to serve a lot of the key destinations for transit that we don't currently serve. The Hastings corridor, for example, is among the busiest buses in Metro Vancouver, while serving Brentwood, Metrotown, and Oakridge along 41st would serve probably the largest 3 transit-oriented development projects in Metro Vancouver. With all of this in mind, I think it's critical that we start thinking long-term. While cities like Montreal and Toronto are expanding their transit drastically, Vancouver is only moving forward with a few extensions. We need to start talking about more drastic improvements so that Metro Vancouver's transit, which is arguably the best in Canada already, continues to thrive. Thanks for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.